wives that had to die. Henry, Henry, Henry had so many, only one survived. 6 wives in all, all the things they could do if they hadn't married Henry, that was their downfall.
When last we spoke, we were discussing Henry VII, Henry Tudor, who rose to the English throne at the end of the Wars of the Roses. We will start off this time by discussing his son, the much more famous Henry VIII. Now, when you learn about Henry VIII, one of the first things you always learn about is that he was married 6 times and that he killed 2 of his wives and many, many, many of the people closest to him. We're going to start off by discussing those wives. You just heard that catchy tune to start the video. I will go over his wives one by one. His first wife was Catherine of Aragon. She was a Spanish princess, and Henry married her after she'd already been married to his brother Arthur. Arthur died, and to solidify the alliance between Spain and England, Henry has to step up and marry Catherine. They were married for a very long time when Henry became king. It was about 20 some odd years. He had a daughter with Catherine that became Mary. She was Mary I of England when she became queen much, much later. But ultimately, Catherine did not give Henry a son, and because she did not have a son, he was worried about his legacy, and he decided that he must divorce her. And of course, Henry already had his eye on a younger woman, Anne Boleyn, who was one of Catherine's ladies-in-waiting. Anne was a Protestant. Henry would have been perfectly happy just sleeping with her, but Anne kind of shrewdly decides, I'm not going to sleep with this man unless he marries me and makes me queen. So he can't just get rid of Catherine. The King of England is a Catholic. The Catholic Church is controlled by the Pope. The Pope will not allow the king to divorce. So Henry decides he wants to be with Anne so much, he doesn't like having his power challenged so much, that they're going to split from the Catholic Church, and Henry is going to form the Church of England, or the Anglican Church. So Anne is a Protestant. This works out fabulously for her. The Catholic Church is no longer a thing in England for the moment. They seize all of the Catholic Church properties and distribute them amongst the wealthy. Mostly the king keeps them all. And Henry is able to get what he wants and divorce Catherine and marry Anne. And of course, Anne does have a child, but it is not a boy. It is a girl, and the girl's name is Elizabeth, later become Elizabeth I, Queen of England. So Elizabeth not being a boy really messes things up for Anne. Anne also has a few miscarriages. Henry quickly becomes disillusioned, and he wants to get rid of Anne as well. It's not going to be good enough to divorce her, so Anne Boleyn loses her head. Henry has her executed, and on that same day, he becomes betrothed or promised to be married to Jane Seymour. So Anne is barely cold in the grave when Henry marries Jane Seymour, and Jane Seymour, lo and behold, is finally able to give Henry what he wants the most, and that is a son. Edward is that little boy. He is a sickly little boy from the get-go, and unfortunately, childbirth proves too much for Jane, and Jane dies. Now, there's this little rhyme that English school children are taught to remember the wives of Henry VIII, and it goes, divorced, beheaded, and died. Divorced, beheaded, survived. And we're about halfway through that. We're at the died, in divorced, beheaded, and died, when Jane Seymour passes away. Now, Henry, he's getting up there in age, but he's still young enough to be married, take a new wife, and potentially have another child. So he marries Anne of Cleves. So it's another opportunity for him to make an alliance by marrying a foreign nobility, marrying into the foreign nobility. He sees a painting of Anne, and he thinks that she looks really young and really pretty, and he's into that until she arrives, and he realizes that paintings don't always look like the things they are paintings of. It's not a photograph, guy. So he decides that she's not as attractive as he thought, doesn't like her. There's a lot going on there. He's already older. He's starting to get sickly. There's a chance that he couldn't perform his marriage duties, and decided to take that out on Anne, and he has that wedding, that marriage annulled. And, it could have been worse. Anne could have been locked away, or she could have been beheaded like his first wife named Anne. Instead, he kind of puts Anne of Cleves off to the side, gives her a castle to live in and a lot of money to keep up her household, and he kind of treats her more like a sister, so it wasn't that bad for her in the end. And next, he marries another young, attractive woman, Catherine Howard. This could be a little bit gross. Henry might have been around 50. Catherine could have been 14, 15, somewhere in there. But it was something like he just kind of thought, marrying a young woman will keep me young and alive. And that was not a great decision for Catherine Howard, actually. So things don't go well. Catherine sleeps around, basically, they said, with people closer to her own age, which kind of makes sense. And Henry doesn't deal very well with that. So he takes Catherine Howard's head as well. And his last wife there is going to be Catherine Parr. All right, so now we have basically 3 Catherines and 2 Annes and 1 Jane. Catherine Parr actually survives. Henry dies, and Catherine is left there kind of taking care of Elizabeth and Edward rises to the throne. So we have our divorced, beheaded, and died, divorced, beheaded, survived.
He was a powerful king whose break with the Church of Rome would forever change the course of English history. But was he a charismatic reformer or a bullying tyrant? Find out on History versus Henry VIII.
Order. Now, who do we have here? Looks like quite the dashing fellow.
Indeed, Your Honor. This is Henry VIII, the acclaimed king who reformed England's religion and government and set it on course to becoming a modern nation.
I beg to differ. This is a cruel, impulsive, and extravagant king who had as little regard for his people as he did for his 6 wives.
6 wives?
Your Honor, Henry's first marriage was arranged for him when he was only a child. He only married Catherine of Aragon to strengthen England's alliance with Spain.
An alliance he was willing to toss aside with no regard for the nation.
Henry had every regard for the nation. It was imperative to secure the Tudor dynasty by producing a male heir, something Catherine failed to do in over 20 years of marriage.
It takes 2 to make an heir, Your Honor.
Regardless, England needed a new queen to ensure stability, but the Pope refused to annul the union and let the king remarry.
Sounds like quite a pickle. Can't argue with the Pope.
And yet that's exactly what the king decided to do. He uprooted the country's religious foundations and broke the Church of England away from Rome, leading to centuries of strife.
All Henry did was give the church honest domestic leadership. He freed his subjects from the corrupt Roman Catholic establishment, and by rejecting the more radical changes of the Protestant Reformation, he allowed his people to preserve most of their religious traditions.
Objection. The church had been a beloved and popular institution that brought comfort and charity to the masses. Thanks to Henry, church property was seized, hospitals closed, and precious monastic libraries lost forever, all to enrich the crown.
Some of the funds were used to build new cathedrals and open secular schools, and it was necessary for England to bring its affairs under its own control, rather than Rome's.
You mean under Henry's control?
Not true. All of the king's major reforms went through Parliament. No other country of the time allowed its people such a say in government.
He used Parliament as a rubber stamp for his own personal will. Meanwhile, he ruled like a tyrant. executing those he suspected of disloyalty. Among his victims were the great statesman and philosopher Thomas More, once his close friend and advisor, and Anne Boleyn, the new queen Henry had torn the country apart to marry.
He executed his own wife?
That wasn't King Henry's initiative. She was accused of treason in a power struggle with the king's minister, Thomas Cromwell.
The trial was a sham, and she wouldn't have been convicted without Henry's approval. Besides, he wasn't too upset by the outcome. He married Jane Seymour just 11 days later.
A marriage that, I note, succeeded in producing a male heir and guaranteeing a stable succession, though the new queen tragically died in childbirth.
This tragedy didn't deter him from an ill-conceived fourth marriage to Anne of Cleves, which Henry then annulled on a whim and used as an excuse to execute Cromwell. As if that weren't enough, he then married Catherine Howard, a cousin of Anne Boleyn, before having her executed too.
She was engaged in adultery to which she confessed. Regardless, Henry's final marriage to Catherine Parr was actually very successful.
His sixth. It only goes to show he was an intemperate king who allowed faction and intrigue to rule his court, concerned only with his own pleasure and grandiosity.
That grandiosity was part of the king's role as a model for his people. He was a learned scholar and musician who generously patronized the arts, as well as being an imposing warrior and sportsman. And the lavish tournaments he hosted enhanced England's reputation on the world stage.
And yet both his foreign and domestic policies were a disaster. His campaigns in France and his brutal invasion of Scotland drained the treasury, and his attempt to pay for it by debasing the coinage led to constant inflation. The lords and landowners responded by removing access to common pastures and turning the peasant population into beggars.
Beggars who would soon become yeoman farmers. The enclosures made farming more efficient and created a labor surplus that laid the foundation for the Industrial Revolution. England would never have become the great power that it did without them and without Henry.
Well, I think no matter what, we can all agree he looks great in that portrait.
A devout believer who broke with the church, a man of learning who executed scholars, a king who brought stability to the throne but used it to promote his own glory. Henry VIII embodied all the contradictions of monarchy on the verge of the modern era, but separating the ruler from the myth is all part of putting history on trial. Check out more videos in our History Versus series to see how some of the world's most controversial leaders wielded their power.
Elizabeth I, Queen of England, 1533 to 1603. Elizabeth was born in Greenwich on the 7th of September 1533. She was the daughter of Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn. Elizabeth's mother, Anne Boleyn, would be executed for adultery when Elizabeth was just 2 years old. Henry's last wife, Catherine Parr, made sure Elizabeth was highly educated and could speak several languages fluently. When Henry died in 1547, Elizabeth's half-brother Edward became king, while she would live with Catherine Parr. Edward died in 1553, which meant that Elizabeth's older half-sister Mary became queen. Mary was determined to return England to Catholicism, and because Elizabeth was Protestant, she imprisoned her in the Tower of London. Mary died from illness in 1558, making Elizabeth her successor to the throne. She became Queen of England at age 25. Elizabeth returned England to Protestantism, developing the Church of England while maintaining some Catholic elements such as the crucifix, therefore appeasing both sides. The Privy Council was reduced, and its Catholic influence reduced by removing such members. Elizabeth assembled experienced and trustworthy advisors, including William Cecil, Lord Burleigh, who was her Secretary of State, and Sir Francis Walsingham, in charge of gathering intelligence, Nicholas Bacon, Lord Keeper of the Great Seal, and Nicholas Throckmorton, Ambassador to France. One advisor called Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester, was very close to the Queen and may have been a romantic interest. Despite numerous courtships and expectation to continue the Tudor dynasty with an heir, Elizabeth declined marriage, stating the welfare of her country was her priority, to an insistent parliament. During Elizabeth's reign, England saw a golden age of progress. Trade expanded rapidly, bringing in wealth, and exploration brought prestige to the country. In 1580, Francis Drake became the first Englishman to successfully circumnavigate the Earth, and 5 years later, Sir Walter Raleigh formed a colony on the east coast of North America, named Virginia. The arts also flourished in theatre, poetry and music, with such playwrights as William Shakespeare. A big challenge would face Elizabeth in 1588. In 1587, Elizabeth had her cousin, Mary, Queen of Scots, her nearest heir, executed. Mary was a Catholic and had been imprisoned by Elizabeth as a threat to the throne, especially as there was no marriage or Protestant heir produced by Elizabeth. An uncovering of a conspiracy to overthrow the Queen ended in Mary being tried for treason after years of surveillance. After Mary's execution, Catholic King Philip II of Spain launched an invasion of England to remove Elizabeth and restore Catholicism. As he launched the Spanish Armada, Elizabeth made a speech to the English soldiers at Tilbury. "I know I have the body of a weak, feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king, and of a king of England too." The English navy, aided by bad weather, would severely defeat the invading Armada. On the 24th of March 1603, Elizabeth died at Richmond Palace. As there was no Tudor heir, the dynasty would come to an end, and she would be succeeded by the Protestant James VI of Scotland, the son of her cousin Mary, Queen of Scots. Subscribe for more history videos.
Thank you guys for all your support on the Simple History YouTube channel. If you enjoy it, please consider visiting our Patreon page. There, you can show us your support for the channel by donating and make a huge difference in what we're able to create for you. Plus, you can get early access on upcoming videos. So let's keep it growing, and thank you for being part of this amazing community.
Hi, I'm John Green, and this is Crash Course European History. So, as we saw last week, absolutism was in the air during the 17th century, but not just in France. Across the English Channel, King James VI of Scotland became King James I of England after the death of the childless Elizabeth in 1603, and he found himself thinking, I might not agree with those French Catholics about everything, but they are on to something when it comes to the divine right of kings to have absolute power. The inhabitants of the British Isles, however, weren't so sure. In fact, Protestant reformers were imagining a different idea of government. That's right, my friends. The constitutions are coming. So when he inherited the British throne, James aspired to unite his holdings in Wales, England, Scotland, and Ireland into a more cohesive whole, but of course those regions, despite their geographic proximity, contain quite a lot of religious, ethnic, and economic diversity. Religiously, Calvinists, called Presbyterians in Scotland, Catholics, and Anglicans had big disagreements. Also, if you've ever been to a Scottish bar and accidentally said how much you're enjoying your visit to England, you will know that Scottish people are not English. True story, by the way. The entire bar went quiet all at once. It was really uncomfortable, and then I tried to fill that silence by saying, well, you have the same money, which also didn't go over great. James thought he could solve these problems by taking the title of King of Great Britain, one place, one king. He also had his officials institute English laws across all his kingdoms and promote adherence to Anglicanism, and he sought to keep the peace among Europe's great families by marrying his son Charles to Henrietta Maria, the Catholic sister of Francis Louis XIII. But that only ended up furthering divisions because Henrietta Maria refused to convert to Anglicanism and became a target for opponents from various factions. Henrietta Maria's husband, James's son Charles, came to the throne in 1625, and he too firmly believed in the divine right of kings because, of course he did. He was backed by the nobility and about half of the gentry, or the wealthy landowners who were below the nobility, but other members of the gentry opposed the idea of absolutist monarchical power, as did many other less powerful people, including many farmers and much of the merchant classes who tended to live in cities. Those groups didn't have titles or ancient claims to land, but they were driving much of Britain's economy, and they felt that the elected English Parliament should have more power, because of course that would also mean that they had more power. In 1628, Charles bowed to that parliamentary strength by agreeing to the Petition of Right, which said that the king could not raise taxes without Parliament's permission, But then he was like, I think I might have found a loophole, and he basically ghosted them. He simply stopped calling Parliament back into session, which of course infuriated Parliament, and also felt like a rather blatant absolutist move from a king who had just agreed to a check on his power. Meanwhile, Puritans, who objected to the pomp of Anglicanism with its statues and stained glass and incense, resisted the Archbishop of Canterbury named William Laud, who was attempting to bring the Puritans back to Anglican orthodoxy. Puritan critics were tortured, sometimes put into the stocks or whipped. Some had their faces mutilated, as were members of the upper classes who disapproved of the king and his administration. Then Laud stirred up defiance among the Presbyterians in Scotland, whom he also aimed to restore to Anglicanism. He pushed them to adopt a new version of the prayer book of the Anglican Church, and resistance to that was literally riotous. Young women hurled the new prayer books during religious services and provoked their congregations to join them. In fact, the Presbyterian Scots were eventually so enraged that they invaded England. In response, after more than a decade of refusing to summon Parliament, Charles was like, Parliament, can you come back, please? I need your support in declaring war. Like many a ruler, Charles I thought that warfare, which he undertook on numerous occasions, would make Parliament rally around him and allow him to raise taxes. But that was a big mistake. Instead, the representatives responded by removing Archbishop Laud from power, decreeing that Parliament must meet at least every 3 years, and putting additional roadblocks in Charles's way. When Charles called on soldiers to arrest the members of Parliament who had thwarted his demands, outright civil war erupted. Between 1642 and 1646, those loyal to the king, called Cavaliers, faced off against those loyal to Parliament, called Roundheads, because of their short haircuts. Parliamentary forces raised the New Model Army, led by Oliver Cromwell, and this new army saw opposing religious sects let go of their differences, which allowed them ultimately to capture Charles I and then execute him in 1649. We also have to remember that during these years, the Little Ice Age was taking its toll. Many people died from famine. Furthermore, between 1625 and 1636, the bubonic plague killed some 45,000 people in London alone. Amid successive bad weather, entire villages disappeared as their inhabitants either died of illness or starvation, or else abandoned their communities in search of food. And all of that enhanced the resistance and criticism of those who found it impossible to pay more taxes so that Charles could realize his absolutist dreams and fight his wars. A higher percentage of Britain's population died in this period than during both World War I and World War II combined. But with the war ended and Charles defeated, England was now a republic, although not quite like contemporary republics, since it was ruled by the increasingly dictatorial Oliver Cromwell. Although, come to think of it, that does make it like some contemporary republics. Cromwell was still the head of the New Model Army, but without a shared enemy in the king, all those varying sects and religious factions went back to squabbling with each other until Cromwell wiped out those in the New Model Army who objected to the policies of his Puritan regime. Cromwell's army, for instance, crushed the Catholics in Ireland, whom it was suspected favored a restored monarchy, but even so, Cromwell could not keep his army or his government unified, despite building a very impressive network of spies. In 1658, after less than a decade in power, Cromwell died, and as civil war once more seemed inevitable, in 1660, Parliament summoned Charles II to the throne. Did the center of the world just open? Is there a wig in there? Am I going to have to put that on, Stan? So this was the time in English history when the wigs that I, at least, associate with English history and fancy British people started to be a thing. What purpose did they serve? Well, then as now, they were a way of concealing hair loss, but also people like to cut their hair short to minimize the risk of lice. So now I'm worried that this wig that Stan gave me has lice, and we're going to move on with the video. So Charles II was summoned by Parliament to become the English king, and you might be wondering why someone who'd seen his father executed for being King Charles I would want to become King Charles II, but humans are moths that fly toward the light of power, my friends, and Charles II thought he could be a better king. In some ways, he was. His reign began the so-called Restoration, a time of creativity and discovery, and also further tragedy. In 1665, a another outbreak of plague quickly killed some 30,000 people. The next year, fire broke out in London, destroying more than 10,000 buildings, including many churches and businesses. The monument to the Great Fire of London encapsulates just how thoroughly religious disagreements shaped every facet of human life. Even when memorializing the dead, the monument's inscribers couldn't help but make it sectarian, writing, "Here, by permission of heaven, hell broke loose upon this Protestant city, the most dreadful burning of this city, begun and carried on by treachery and malice of the popish faction." Now, of course, that wasn't true. The fire started in a bakery run by an Anglican. Charles II, meanwhile, had a Catholic mother in Henrietta Maria and was seen to be gravitating toward what that monument called the popish faction. He loosened restrictions on Catholics and other dissenters, a move Parliament responded to with the Test Act of 1673, which excluded all those who weren't loyal to the Anglican Church from government positions. So just for a quick recap, James I tried to unite all of Great Britain and Ireland under one absolutist crown before dying in 1625. His son Charles I ended up being on the losing side of the English Civil War and was separated from his head in 1649, at which point Britain technically became a republic that more closely resembled a military dictatorship, which eventually failed, leading in 1660 to Charles II becoming king. Charles II had at least 12 children, but none with his wife, so his rightful heir was his brother James, a Catholic, who would eventually become king, but only for a few years. The Stuart drive for absolutism halted for good in between 1688 and 1689, when the Catholic ways of James II just became too much for the pro-Parliament advocates, and when, to compound the danger, James's second wife gave birth to a son and heir. James's older daughter Mary and her spouse William III were summoned as monarchs to replace James II, but only after they agreed to rule by a Bill of Rights. This document stated in its first article that no monarch would reject or publish a decree without the consent of Parliament.
Her life was spent more playing cards, chatting, being ill, and having 19 pregnancies. These pregnancies were watched with fascination by an elderly lady in Hanover, Sophia, the Electress Duchess of Brunswick-Lüneburg. She was James I's granddaughter, and because there were so few Protestants of the blood royal left alive, she was, by Act of Parliament, next in line to the throne, if Anne died childless, and if she lived long enough. One by one, Anne's pregnancies came and went. 14 miscarriages and stillbirths, 5 live births, but by the time Anne was widowed in 1708, all of them were dead. Sophia, aged 78, now just had to outlive the 43-year-old Anne to become Queen of England. Anne was a sick woman. Sophia was tough as an old boot. She knew she could do it. But in 1714, Sophia received an outrageous letter from Anne. Anne had somehow got the impression that Sophia was going to secretly send her son George to England in some kind of plot, and she told Sophia that would not be allowed. Sophia, now 84, was shocked, and the shock killed her, just 9 weeks before Queen Anne died. Sophia had failed, but her son George would now be king. Queen Anne has died. There are no Protestant Stuarts left. The Protestant line to the English throne now passes through James's granddaughter, Sophia, who had married a German prince with the title of Elector of Hanover, and then from her to her son George Louis, who's inherited that antiquated title. Into one quarter of the royal coat of arms pops the amazingly complicated device of a 54-year-old German princeling. And when he comes to England for his coronation, he knows perfectly well that he's not going to be anything like those other rulers. He will be almost powerless. So it really doesn't matter that he can't speak a word of English. At the opening of Parliament, King George stood in silence while his words were read by the Lord Chamberlain. The crown that had belonged to Normans, French Plantagenets, Welsh Tudors, and Scottish Stuarts had now passed to the German Hanoverians. And there were Scottish noblemen who thought that with George lacking support in England, this might be an opportunity to hand the throne back to the Stuart family, and in particular to James II's son, living in France and known as the Pretender. The French thought this would be a great idea. Louis XIV's mistress, Madame de Maintenon, even presented him with a song to be sung on his accession. It had originally been written for Louis to celebrate his recovery from a surgical procedure on his bottom. She translated it for the man who should, she thought, be James VIII of Scotland, and, why not, James III of England.
God save a gracious King, long live a noble King, God save the King.
The song turned out to be a bigger hit than the man. Jacobite Rising of 1715 was a complete flop, and after spending a couple of months wandering around the Highlands, James went home to France. George's throne was safe. He spent every winter in Hanover and left the government of England to his ministers. His own work was done by a new figure, the Prime Minister, a politician acting as a king's substitute. The first man to take on this role was Robert Walpole. Since Walpole didn't speak German, the pair of them communicated in schoolboy Latin. King George died a sudden death in 1727 while in Hanover, aged 67.
So George I and George II didn't have a particularly good relationship. George I passes away, and George II ascends to the throne. He's still aided by a prime minister during this time, leading the governmental side of the country. George II and his son, Frederick, also didn't have a great relationship. That seems to be a thing about the Hanovers. And unfortunately, Frederick dies estranged from his father and before he can become king. So when George II dies in around 1760, it's not his son, but his grandson, George III, who takes the throne. So for our purposes, George II is in there as the King of England at the beginning of a conflict known as the 7 Years' War, and it is his grandson, George III, who takes over and wears the crown before the 7 Years' War is over. George III is frequently cast as the bad guy in the conflict between the British and the colonists that leads to America achieving its independence. He was certainly the last monarch before that happened. He is also remembered as the king who sort of went crazy on the throne and had to have his successor lead the country during his infirmity. So we're going to talk more about that and that revolution in the next video.